We are going to get started. I know it's been a long day for everyone, so I would appreciate if we could. Ms. Schultz, thank you. We're starting. We're starting. So just to let everyone know, today we are reviewing the CIP with a focus on being ready to pass this at our next meeting. So to that point, I know most of the people in this room have had a chance to meet individually with staff, and I hope they've been able to address your individual questions. More can be brought up tonight, but just to try to frame our conversation, we will be focused on any updates or changes to the CIP from last year. Staff will go through those with us, and they will also lead us on a discussion on the immediate priorities and asks that they have of the board, of decisions that do need to be made before the CIP is finalized. So unless there's anything else I'm missing, I will let Jeff and Kevin go ahead and take over, and I am hoping we will be done by 6:30. We'll do our best, but please remember any individual follow-up questions you can address with Jeff and Kevin.
Thank you very much, Ms. Palachuk, and certainly what an exciting day, right? We've gone through all of the things that you would think of, goal one, and then getting into the budget deliberation conversations, which are always spirited. And then, of course, certainly capping it off with the CIP. Certainly somebody asking you, how was your day? You can tell them it was everything the brochure promised. Well, as you know, we've been going through a series of meetings, much like the budget, a series of meetings about the capital improvement program. And in that, we've gotten a lot of good feedback. We've had individual meetings with most of the school board members, and we have a couple more to follow with actually three of the members we haven't had the opportunity to meet with due to scheduling, to get individual feedback and insights, both short-term and long-term within the CIP. Keep in mind, when we briefed on the CIP, a couple of the key tenets were that we have an increased enrollment in the school year 2016-2017. Well, our births 5 years ago decreased as compared to the prior year. The birth to kindergarten ratio increased by 2% as compared to last year, meaning 5 years later. We've had a positive net migration experienced in all grades except cohorts in the 9th, 10th. Since school year 2008-2009, our student membership in Fairfax County Public Schools has seen a growth of total enrollment of more than 21,000 students. Now, keep in mind, Arlington County Public Schools, their most recent September 30th data shows that they have just over 26,000 students. So when you look at our growth rate and you look at surrounding jurisdictions, you look at the size of those jurisdictions, although we may see leveling off in our CIP, we do see that we have grown over that period of time the size of some of these other school divisions. So there are really two asks that we're really asking you for. On page 41 of the CIP document, we reference that page as it really suggests the marching orders, if you will, for the facilities planning staff. And on that page, we have a number of recommendations, but the two that we're asking for today with concurrence on is really the pursuit of and the continuance of the Thoreau Middle School boundary discussion. And then also the other one is the Bucknell Elementary School boundary discussion. So those are the two that staff is really going to be asking for. The other elements that are on there, certainly we can discuss. I know through the meetings that we've had with each of you that we have had, and I expect it for those of you that we have not yet had the opportunity to meet with, that we're going to be talking about individual nuances within your magisterial district that will either end up, some of them are reflections within each of the individual pyramid pages and under each of the school articulations of what that further states as we might want to monitor. But in fact, some may be added for priority recommendations in the future. So with that, Ms. Palachuk, that's pretty much a summary of where we are in terms of staff. And keep in mind, this is the fourth meeting, this work session, the January 23rd work session. We had one Monday, December 5th, 2016. We had a presentation Thursday, December 15th, a public hearing Tuesday, January 10th, today's work session, and then, of course, Thursday evening, January 26th meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Plattenberg. Before we take questions, do you mind maybe explaining, we're looking at those first two, what it means, right? The scope of what will happen. I think there's nothing set in stone yet.
Right.
And then also the slight changes, I believe 3 projects were named.
For additions, yeah. I'll let Mr. Sneed go kind of into that.
Thank you.
And first of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Quinn, of course, in her leadership with us, FPAC's assistance, Mr. Sneed certainly, and Dr. Hollop, just all of the work that our team has put in really to give this kind of the planning commissioners about our communication and coordination, and a lot of members of the community have said that this planning document has been more transparent and more easily understandable. What you've asked for, Ms. Palchik, is really the process associated with what we do in any boundary process is during one iteration, you'll see some recommend in the spring and some recommend starting in the fall, and some say TBD, to be determined, and we can flesh that out a little bit more in this conversation. But it really is to go out to the community and to identify the scoping. For example, if we were to talk about Bucknell, I'll just throw that one out there. Bless you. What may appear logical and intuitive from a staffing standpoint, because of the way that we geocode students and know by each student where they live, where they reside, and when we look at planning areas, and we look at them in their subdivisions and their communities, and we say this is a logical move for students that would really be attending school A, and I use Bucknell for an example because we're going to finishing up construction and have approximately 300 seats. What may seem logical and intuitive to a planning staff or to our group may not be reflective of really what the community needs are. And in fact, part of our discussions and our individual discussions with Ms. Corbett Sanders, in fact, found some of those exact things of how we looked at if we were conceptualizing, because it is a concept, if we were conceptualizing any of these possibilities, what would that further look like down the road? And then we take that out to the community and hopefully get better informed, and then that information then is transmitted through the governing body for ultimately, after the scoping, then the actual boundary adjustment process itself and voting on by the school board members. But with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Sneed and let him kind of really clear up anything I might have left off. I know the question was specifically about Thoreau and Bucknell and what that would mean for both of those, and then the additions for Stewart, Madison, and I think, I forget the last school, West Potomac.
Correct. You guys are more awake than I thought you would be after this period of time. Yeah, so I'm impressed. So we did try to keep the CIP simple this year. The only true changes that we initiated were proposed additions for West Potomac High School, which we're all aware has seen an increase in enrollment and is projected to continue to increase to over 2,900 students over the next 5 years. And then Stewart High School, which has also been on our radar for a number of years, as well as Madison. Typically, West Potomac's need is far greater than you could solve with a simple modular. And Stewart and Madison, they're even though they're going to have growth, they're going to be close to that. But the problem with the Stewart and the Madison site is they're very, very small. I mean, Stewart is our smallest high school site, and Madison is not much larger. So for that reason, as we see the growth, we felt that we had a need to introduce additions there. And I will also say that due to the small size of Stewart and Madison, we're going to actually have to take an approach similar to what we were compelled to do at West Springfield, is we're going to have to build on top of the existing structure because you just don't have any land mass there. Turning to the two boundary priorities that Jeff spoke about previously. One, Thoreau Middle School, when we designed it, we built it as a full 10-team middle school. So has roughly the capacity to accommodate about 1,350 students. Part of the idea behind that was we also recognize the fact that Luther Jackson continues to see a significant increase in students, and we have a number of students who don't directly feed into Falls Church High School through Luther Jackson, but instead are Oakton High School students who live near Oakton High School and are subsequently transported beyond Thoreau into to Jackson. So the idea behind this would be to look at trying to balance the Jackson enrollment using the surplus capacity that we currently have at Thoreau. So, but that doesn't mean that would be the entire scope. But we would certainly look at it from a transportation perspective. In addition, Bucknell, during the planning, and actually right before we bid the project, it was decided that we would increase the capacity. It's a small school. I think it's a little over 300 students right now. And we were instructed to have a minimum school size of 600. Our out-year projections for Bucknell show them dropping to almost 250 students. So it's likely that they could, currently they would have about 300 extra seats. And in the out years, almost 350. We have a number of schools in that area that are overcrowded, and we thought that if absent a significant growth within the Bucknell boundary, that we would probably be warranted to look at other schools nearby to provide some type of relief. So this would just be a limited boundary study to help a couple of the adjacent schools. So those are either the priority boundaries or just the new projects that are introduced in the CIP.
All right, well, thank you. As meeting manager, I will try to represent our gratitude for really, I think it's always been a robust and the work you've done this year. I'm sure it's all Dr. Holub, thank you. Just kidding. No, but thank you for your team to everything you've done to try to continue to make this a transparent process. And I think we had a discussion earlier about wanting to have both recommendations from our staff, but understanding that that then comes into large does such a a thoughtful job of helping bring us as much information as possible with your recommendations, improving as much as can possibly be improved our ability to project numbers. I think you have an excellent system, and then taking the time to meet with us and work with the community in scoping. So thank you so much for your work on this. We are all so appreciative. And before I take questions, I saw Ms. Strauss. I do want to remind my colleagues, Ms. McLaughlin, if you don't mind taking, I think we have Ms. Strauss and then Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Just a reminder that we do want to try to focus on the decisions, the priorities on here, on the updates to CIP, and they're happy to take individual, concerns and longer-term issues, but maybe some of those will be to come back and have conversations after today. Okay, so with that, I think we have Ms. Strauss followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Okay, thank you. So again, you want to make sure that the school board is first in line with these 4 recommendations, correct? Because this is your current timeline.
Correct.
Okay, then I am assuming is the Thoreau renovation, is that complete? Okay, and I know you added space, so that the boundary decision would begin. The process would be next fall. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The Bucknell, they are still under renovation, right? And that's funded. So, and these, school board members, we were quite well aware from the time that the Bucknell renovation was proposed, funded, et cetera, that would be part of the deal. The school would be enlarged. You've been talking about that. So that's kind of a given, I am assuming. The West Potomac piece, that has to do with the funding set aside for the new elementary school and what's going to happen down there. The Fairfax Oakton Elementary School, where is the use of the land behind McNair? Is that the school that is?
No, ma'am. That's Northwest Elementary School.
Okay, so that is the other. So where is the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School?
That's a good question.
Okay, that's okay. That all right. So then we're into.
I would like to know.
More of a future question.
Okay.
I would like to know as well, but we do have, if you recall back in December when we talked about some of the areas where we had significant growth,
Right.
both the Madison and Oakton Pyramid witnessed quite a bit of one of the few areas where we were seeing growth at the elementary level that was consistent. So this has been in the cash flow for a number of years. So we are going to need to construct a school. We do own a 5-acre site currently, which is at the intersection of Nutley and Route 29.
Okay.
It's kind of across the woods across from kind of between Pan Am and Circle Towers.
Okay.
Down there.
So we own a small site.
5 acres.
That would be an urban site.
Yeah, it's 5 acres and it doesn't have any road frontage to
So it would
Route
be
29.
difficult, yeah.
I also wanted to clarify, we misspoke. So we were hopeful that for Thoreau Jackson not to do the complete boundary study, we would like to start the scoping this spring, and then the boundary study in the fall of 2017. And
So we'd need to change this
Right.
to reflect that, and that's the concurrence we're looking for. And he's going to also talk about Bucknell as well, that we need to change, clarify, and update.
Right, and then Bucknell, we would like to scope that in the fall of 17 and the actual boundary study in the spring of 2018. That was
Okay.
our goal.
So the bottom line with these pieces, that most of us are well aware of the needs and of the progress that's being made as this comes forward. But you're not sure that you actually have a viable site for the Fairfax Oakton Elementary School. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, we have a little bit of time with that one because, as Mr. C mentioned, we do have a site, but we also have a Board of Supervisor member who has a parcel in mind as well that's not our property, that was our property at one time. So that sounds like a further conversation, and that's what it requires. So I'm really not prepared to really go into too much detail about those two. Our ask is really for the Bucknell and for the Thoreau, and that's our ask for today for the concurrence.
Okay, and I'm fine with moving forward with that. I'm well aware of the need and what you need to do with that. After we go through these pieces, I do have other questions and other things that I need to bring up publicly. But I am fine with where you are, and if you can find that Fairfax Oakton site somehow that is workable, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Just as my personal quick response, I think that site, because it is my district, there are a few possibilities, but it is further down the line and it is a larger conversation, but I'm sure there will be updates after this year. Next we have Ms. Corbett-Sanders, followed by Ms. Hines.
Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much. You all have put so much effort into this report, into the plan, into working with the community to get to know my community in particular, and it's greatly appreciated. I think when we look at what's happening in the CIP, though we do need to look at it in a broader perspective of what is happening more holistically as to what is happening in the whole region between Mount Vernon and Lee. There is so much development going on. Every day we're hearing new projects being recommended, proffers being written, and so and dirt being turned. And so I do think that we need to move forward on the Bucknell scoping, and I think your timeline is the right timeline. But in looking at the overall development in that region, it's going to be something that's going to need to take more of a holistic view that doesn't just kind of move deck chairs on the Titanic within one boundary or one pyramid. It's it's something that we have to look at multiple pyramids and look at the impact of demographics, construction, and frankly, transportation, with the focus of creating community schools.
That's an excellent point, Ms. Corbett Sanders. That's one of the things that you and I know Ms. Derenak Koufax had talked to us about. When we take a look, the understanding that we need to move forward because we've got real capacity issues immediately right now. We also have space availability. So, our preference has been to constantly push the need to address that short term, but also I think you two have done an excellent job of saying not only do you look at that short term, but you've got to look down the road because long term, you've got situations based in this CIP that identify overcrowding conditions at West Potomac. You've got seats at Mount Vernon. You've got Hayfield. I know Ms. Derenak Koufax has asked about Hayfield. So we do need to continue the conversation. And we have been looking at it from a holistic while we are doing surgically and targeted boundary recommendations. And I think that's one of the things about the scoping process that's been beneficial with working with the communities. If we get the concurrence today and we're able to proceed forward, I think that scoping will help flesh out some of those issues and concerns that need to be teased out in order to garner further conversation about the long view versus just the short term. So it's an excellent point.
Thank you. Thank you. We have Ms. Hines followed by Ms. Evans.
Okay, thank you. Quick question about Madison High School. So did I hear you say basically that because it's a small piece of property, we're going to have to go up? So Madison might be like 3 stories when we're done?
Well, I graduated from that school, so I know most of it. I've been thinking, Stuart is a tougher site than Madison, but they're basically identical footprints, both of them. So, there's probably a couple candidates. Once we hire consultants, provided that the bond were to pass, we would probably come up with a couple of scenarios. There is each of those have a single. There's a wing that is a single story. It's a former, kind of the side of the building where the cafeteria is, and they used to be shops and other things like that. Those maybe those would be the simpler ones, but I'm not sure. There's no way to know. I know when we started West Springfield, we had to face the same thing. West Springfield also doesn't have a lot of lay-down room around it, just the way the building is situated on the site. So we were faced with a similar situation, and there we actually we're constructing a superstructure over a 2-story section. Because I'm not particularly comfortable with resting on existing buildings, just because I can never really be certain whether the construction would hold it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that'd be interesting to watch. One other question, and I know that Ms. Palchik and I will meet with you tomorrow, actually, to talk about our areas, and I assume we'll talk more about Thoreau. But I think, just a couple of questions. One is the size of the boundary shift that you're anticipating, I'm assuming is not administrative size. It's not boundary light size. So it's a full-on boundary thing. Okay.
Correct. It's you're talking about at least 200 students, and we were not proposing to affect the AAP Center. These were only general education students. So wherever the Jackson AAP currently pulls from, that would remain. This was only general education students.
Okay, so that was one of my other questions was, we're leaving the AAP Center alone at this time. But I have a running question about that, which is, is it still recommended from an instructional perspective to have a center at Jackson rather than, keeping the Thoreau kids at Thoreau? Because for years that's been a conversation in Vienna. Folks would rather have all their kids at their neighborhood school. And I think, we put it in Jackson for good reasons, but now that Jackson's population is growing and possibly changing, I think we should consider to think about whether or not we need to have a center there. And if we pull the Thoreau kids back to Thoreau from the AAP Center at Jackson, we want to make sure that we have enough capacity at Thoreau to do that down the road, right?
Yeah, so you would have to be, we have to be careful, and we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. We can see based on each of the student planning areas of the Oakton kids who currently feed into Jackson. So you may not be able to take all of them and AAP, but we're happy to discuss that. And we want to be as cautious as you. The last thing we want to see is then we wind up with an overcrowded Thoreau, and you still have an overcrowded Jackson. I mean, Jackson is projected to hit almost 1,600 students in 5 years. I mean, it's probably a little larger than we would like in middle school.
Sure, wow.
regardless.
Okay. And so then the other question that I'll be asking you about tomorrow is, we do think about the demographic mix. And whenever we make a change, if it affects the demographic mix in a way that makes it more segregated, that's something I think we have to think about, right?
Yes, and we're able also to look at the effect of each school with the change, including FRM and demographics both. So we've looked at that.
Okay, thank you. We have Ms. Evans, followed by Mr. Moon.
Okay, so I have a few questions and comments. First of all, I think you've done a great job of putting together a lot of really detailed information for the board. Very pleased, of course, that Falls Church High School is going to be on the 17 bond. Don't be surprised if I ask you to repeat that for the community on Thursday night. I'm sure the community will be very happy to hear that. I did in the section on Region 2, it talks about, one of the things it talks about is adding an AAP center for the Annandale High School pyramid. And I did just want to clarify that decision has not been made. I know you've put it in there as one option that we can use, but that causes some consternation to folks. That would be a significant change, and we have to think about critical mass and what the impact that would have on the current AAP centers. So, again, I'll be clarifying that it's fine to have that as an option in the CIP, but we haven't made that decision yet. That's something down the road. As far as those first two items, I'm fine with those first two items. I do want to make sure that Jackson doesn't lose so many students that it loses energy. I mean, I understand that it's growing, but I do think we need to look also, as Ms. Hines said, the demographic mix. I think that's important for Jackson, so that's something we need to keep in mind. As far as the last two items, I think those are down the road. I realize that it's here in the CIP as something, again, potential, but I think that's something we need to be reviewing with some regularity. One boundary I did not see, and we've just had very initial conversations on it, but the idea of putting the Bryn Mawr Park folks back from Edison back into Annandale High School, I see that the projections for Edison are to be at about 111, and Annandale seems to have space. So I would like to start that conversation with that community. I don't see it in the CIP. It doesn't have to be there this minute, but is that something that you have discussed? And I need to discuss this also with Ms. Darren at Fairfax, since Edison, she primarily represents that school. That was part of the Annandale Regional Study, which it was so desperately overcrowded, and now it's under capacity. So I think that's something that we should review, whether it makes more sense for that community to go back to Annandale. I also note that with Glasgow, it's showing down the road that it's under capacity, but that's only because we're adding a modular, correct? So it's not, to my mind, it's not really under capacity. How many students? It's got like 18,000 now, or 1,800, 1,700.
Yeah, it does climb to the mid 1850s, and it looks like it's going to settle into around a little 1740, 1750. So, the modular project's going to start pretty soon for Glasgow.
Okay. I guess I just think that, and I thought we had a conversation about breaking out the capacity for the modulars. Is that in here someplace, the
Yes,
capacity?
it is in the attachments.
Oh, it's in the attachment. Oh, okay.
And
Oh,
one
I
of the
missed it.
things, because Mr. Moon also mentions to us about trailers, and I was remiss in not saying this. I know we're talking modulars, and there is a distinct difference between the two.
Right.
But, we had approximately 980 some, close to 1,000 trailers.
Right.
We now have approximately 810-ish, okay? So when you go from 1,000 to 800, we have made progress in eliminating, through our renovation program predominantly, and in the attachments as well, we have the recommendation that would provide how to, the questions that Mr. Moon had asked, a specific plan as to how to address that. Unfortunately, they all come with a price tag. And the price tag would need for the increase of our bond cap, which would have been assisted greatly by the meals tax, which was previously discussed, et cetera. But they do have in there. Was there anything else, Kevin, that you wanted to add to that, or is that pretty much it?
Well, so there's an appendix that shows the capacity divided up by core space and modular and trailers? And I've just missed it? Okay. I will go through it again then. On the Stewart situation, where do we stand with the permits now? Have we actually applied?
So Stewart High School, once that will require rezoning. So you'll be very involved as we begin to meet with the supervisor to seek a rezoning of Stewart, and even because right now, due to the small size of the site, the zoning precludes any more addition to the building. So we would have to, even before we spend any money here, we would need to know whether the county was supportive of granting a rezoning and our ability to add to the building.
Okay, so we need to get that process rolling,
I would like
guess.
to do it in the next couple months, so
Okay.
we know, before we actually draft the bond.
Okay. Well, that's fine, and I guess it's one thing that, because the colors have changed dramatically, in the last few years. My area used to be solid red, and now I'm seeing more blues. So, that's just something for us to all be cognizant about, and it might send us in a different direction in some ways, particularly with our overcrowded schools, if there's capacity at other schools. So, thank you so much for a great job.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Moon and Ms. Schultz, and then if someone would like to go back, please let me know.
Since Mr. Plettenberg brought up my favorite unpleasant topic of trailers, that's okay. I was gonna address that anyway, even without you mentioning it. But thanks for the invitation. That I know that's your report is attached toward the end of CIP. I might have missed one work session, but do you recall ever formally presenting the report to us? Or are you planning on doing that sometime?
We could. That was in response.
I would love to have that opportunity. And I would like to present that as a next step at the end of the work session tonight. I was going through that. It's a pretty good report, but I would like to hear that directly from you and have an opportunity to have some discussion and question and answer session, etc.
Sure.
But just to be correct with the numbers, the report seems to be saying that this is a year-old report, going back to I think, March of 2016 timeframe. So about a year. At that time, there was 897 trailers being used for instructional purposes. And then now it is about 100 less than that.
Correct. So when I measure, I don't count trailers, or I continue to count them till project is completed. So, for instance, TJ had 29 trailers. So now we pulled the majority of those out. So when we are looking at this fall, we weren't counting the TJ trailers because they're all
So now you have about 800, is that what you're saying?
about 810.
810,
Right, yeah.
okay. You want to give me an exact number sometime?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Since we are talking about numbers I was just Googling it because I didn't remember everything, that about 7 years ago, we were using about 570 trailers for the instructional purposes. With the great system we have, we only go up. Student achievement, number of trailers, and so, but that particular number which goes up is not something that I am proud of. I know that, I think your report seems to be saying that you were cost us about to the tune of $230 million to eliminate all the trailers. But that's the discussion I think we need to have. I think community needs to hear, especially our funding authority, gotta know, because the plan that seems to be in the report is, because we don't have money, we don't have a particular way to eliminate other than as we renovate the school buildings, will provide enough space to eliminate trailers. But that's going to take us 30 years, 40 years, and that's like 3, 4, 5 times a lifetime of someone's school life from kindergarten to 12th grade. I don't find it acceptable. I don't find it acceptable that we haven't had that public discussion, and we need to have that. And I would like my colleagues' support as a next step.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. We will follow that up in the next step discussion. I have Ms. Schultz, followed by Ms. McLaughlin, and if there are no other first-time speakers, Ms. Strauss has to go back.
All right, so we haven't had a chance to sit down either. I do have some questions about what's on page. It's the document 39 out of 140, and it's actually page 34. Yep, this one. So, first of all, this is the age-old, what is capacity? What's capacity utilization? Capacity versus building versus what? So can you explain again how we're driving what capacity means?
That's an excellent question. So if
I rarely ask non-excellent questions.
Well, if you just asked a good one, I say that's a good one. But a number of years ago, and you see it reflected here, we show both design capacity and program capacity. And these are compared to should be the program. And so, but the first thing to remember, and we've talked about this for a long time, is when we construct a school, you know precisely how the rooms were to be used. If it's a kindergarten first, however many full classrooms you have, and then the program, and that's how you would figure capacity. And it's based on our program of study. So you would use, like we would use in standard school, 3rd through 6th grade, we would figure 28 students per, even, because that's what we list in our budget book roughly as what the student teacher ratio is, and we use 25 for K to 2. So for K to 2, and then 28 for 3rd through 6th. For Title I schools, we use a lower ratio. For K to 3rd, we use 22 this year. So that's kind of how that. So capacity is just the number of space, of actual instructional or classrooms that were built. That's what we refer to as core. And
but all classrooms are not equal, right?
That's
They're not
correct.
all the same size.
Right. So, but even if they weren't, let's say, a typical elementary classroom is 825 square feet, you could, in theory, even though I've never constructed one in 30 years here of smaller than 825, but just say if you had one, an elementary classroom of 750, it would still qualify if it was because it would meet the building code. Now, I'm not saying it's ideal, but your typical core middle and high school classroom is significantly smaller than they probably average only 650 feet, square feet, roughly. I'm not talking about science. So then we apply the program of study. So over time, however the classrooms are used, presently, that affects the program or the actual capacity. So if you had a first grade room that's now being used for, say, band and strings, it would have counted as 25 in the design capacity. Now it doesn't have any value because you don't count at the elementary level. You only count core. Or when you start to have, if you have some, pull out special ed or even a self-contained.
So let me get to the core of why I'm asking this, because if you look at the square feet of these buildings and look at the number of children that are in these buildings, it radically changes. And let me pull out Greenbrier West, for example. It's showing here capacity at 105%, but it's only showing building utilization at 90. Like I have a massive difficulty in understanding how they can be physically over by 5% over their number capacity, but they're showing 10% under their utilization. I know when I talked to Jane Lipp, for example, she literally cannot find space for special programming for special needs students in Region 4. She struggles for the physical capacity. And I look at, Willow Springs, we're over. I mean, there's so many where we're over 100%. I don't even understand how we could be below 90%. And it's part of the bigger conversation. I mean, there's no doubt Ms. Hines got a problem with McNair at 100. I mean, that's patently obvious, but it's as if there's these ones that are bubbling right below the surface that this looks at it in a single set of numbers, but I feel like it's not telling the whole picture.
Right. I think one of the things you're also referring to for utilization is the square feet per student.
Well, it is because there are buildings where we've shoehorned in kids, on a per square foot basis, where they have literally half the amount of square feet per kids in a building compared to another building, but then it says, oh, well, we've got 10% extra room. No, you don't.
It doesn't necessarily, yeah. So one of the things when you look at the square foot per student, when all of the majority of the elementary schools have the same common spaces, which are large: cafeteria, library, X amount of music rooms or art. But what happens is you could have a school that only has 600 students and it has all those common spaces, which elevates their square foot per student. So that's what you start to see.
So in that vein, compare because they're about flipped. Oakview is showing only 95% capacity, but 108% utilization. So does that mean that more of that space is taken up with special education needs and that there's less like you can't physically fit more students in the building because it's taken up with what's the problem? Oh, it's 5. Okay, well, that's the way I was looking at it originally, and then I forgot that I was looking at it that way.
But you make some very good points.
So actually, that was originally the point that I had is how do you show a precipitous, so the growth in Oakview from 95 to 108, I understand. Union Mill, you're showing a 15% drop in that amount of time. How can you, how are we showing 15% is a precipitous, that's a downhill ski slope. And if we have massive building, in-building and I know where the in-building is, and I don't know if everybody knows where their in-building projects are, where you're seeing these squeezed-in neighborhoods where you're adding more children. Okay, I can understand a ski slope up because new building is going in and new children are being added. But how do you get to a precipitous downward trend? But this is the question of stability over time. Like, where is the stability? Like, it's one thing to look at a cohort and say, well, there's X many kindergartners now, and so that's 15% less, so in 5 years, we're going to have 15% less students. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't, that's where we don't take into account the stability of a building over time and building utilization. And see, I've got so many of these buildings, and this is the conversation back to Dr. Lip, is how are we in this discussion, in the planning of, okay, what's a priority? Well, we see an increasing trend, not necessarily in students with disabilities, because that's about 14%, but the types of disabilities tend to be more profound, needing more physical structure, more capital infrastructure. How are we planning for that if we don't look over time? Like, okay, this school population has been, I don't know what McNair looks like if you plot it out, but it's probably been very steady and full and growing, and this is how we went from 100 to 146% over time. I don't think that these populations are changing where you're going to see these precipitous changes if we don't look at them over time.
Right. You raised a good point, Ms. Schultz. You covered pretty much the whole spectrum of planning because, that's an excellent point, right? Thanks for reminding me. Because not only are you talking about the special education or programs that Mr. Snee was referring to that you look at over time, and we've been working with the special education folks in our projection methodology to improve that communication, to improve that projection, to improve that ability, and with Jane Lipp's office. The reality is those are add moves and changes that come, and you'll see that our percent accuracy is really awesome for general ed. We've talked about this. We're not as great, but we're still pretty darn good with the special education, a couple percent higher. But then when we get with the AAP, we've got great opportunities. But to your point, programs like that do take up more square footage per student per space. And therefore, over time, right, we use a 3-year average in our projection methodologies, right? So when you look at those categories, and that's part of our process of working with Jane Lipp to get a better fine-tuning of how long these programs. A lot of schools, our experience has been, if you have a principal that had capacity and had a program need and started growing a program, if you will, at his or her individual school, suddenly other programs came to that school.
But we're still not showing our homework over time. We're still not showing what we projected and then what actually happened. I'm looking at Poplar Tree. You're showing a 19% drop in 5 years. I find that impossible to believe. Coates, I'm looking at 16%. We're showing some very precipitous changes in single school boundaries in a 5-year period. When I look at these figures, and we don't have anything that says this has been the school population for the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. This is what we said it was going to be, and this is what it is. And this is where I think on capital infrastructure planning, we're trying to get better at figuring out with heat maps and geocoding kids. where there's problems, but all this says is this is where we are and this is where we think we're going to be in 5 years, and it doesn't show the context of how stable a community is. And I don't know, Ms. Strauss, if you know the Coates community, if that's a pretty stable community, or it's declining rapidly to the point that you're going to have huh? Yeah, but that's in the future. Okay, so maybe that accounts for, but I don't have any of that in these, and we, Poplar Tree, we put a center there, and, we redirected kids there, and yet you're still telling me it's going to have basically a 20% precipitous drop. So I don't know how we don't get to, in a CIP, showing this is what the population has been, and show it over time, show what we projected, and then what actually happened, and then continue to refine with the stability of a community, as opposed to, there's a smaller cohort, and then all of a sudden we're showing radical changes out 5 years that historically I don't think would prove out.
Okay. Well, thank you for that feedback. What we'll do is we can discuss further, because we do still have a meeting yet with you. This is consistent, Ms. Schultz, really, with what you've said previously. You've told us that you want to see, I trust you, I just don't believe it, or I believe it, I just don't trust you, one or the other. And the reality is, we have a system now that allows us to not only give that as we move forward, and this is what we've told you, which I know doesn't get you to where you want to be. We do look back 3 years, we do look at trend data, but we also recognize we now needed, because of those conversations, the ability to look at what we forecast as we move down the road, and then look back to say, so when you have a question like that.
If nothing else, we know exactly what the population was of every single one of these schools for the last 10 years, except for Mason Crest. We know the population. You could look at a trend line of 10 years of population, and then you could asterisk the ones, and thank you, Ms. Strauss, for bringing up the ones that have been historically in the past affected by a boundary, or are about to be, where that's changing your projections out. But you could lay it out, and we could see where there are stable populations, such that even if you have one or two cohorts that get smaller, it's not going to change the outcome, in 5 years if it didn't change it over the last 10.
Yeah, I hear you. And we've gone through this conversation, Ms. Schultz. I know we've talked about, programs too, that when you look over time and you look at changes and dramatic changes in enrollment, you mentioned Willow Springs. Willow Springs has AAP students that are coming from all over the county to it. I've got kids that I'm transporting from all over the place there, as well as special education students.
Crushed.
And they're crushed.
They're crushed. They can't have. There's so many extracurricular activities that they can't even have a PTA meeting at the building.
Yeah,
they've got to go to a community
and so
building.
When you look at that, there could be further discussion about putting caps on and issues like that. They could be taken up as board matters that are bigger than this. And you raise good points. So I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. McLaughlin, and any other go-backs other than Ms. Strauss? Okay, thank you.
So it's interesting, I'm following behind Ms. Schultz, because I really appreciated my conversations with staff, but I'm also now, looking at these numbers again and trying to figure out how for so long, the projections were all that, Little Run, which is already by size one of the 5-6 smallest elementary schools, and yet, according to this report, it's only a drop from 88% capacity to 86%. And before, the projection was it was going to go down to like 78%, and that's 78% of a small elementary school that right now only has about a little over 300 students in it, and then it runs a special education preschool. So capacity utilization, if most of these elementary schools that were built in that kind of mid-1960s timeframe, how can it be so tiny, and yet it's showing to have more students now and 5 years from now than even Old Creek, which is almost 100 students larger than Little Run. So something's not making sense to me now, and I'm not going to take up time tonight, but I think I'm sort of having a little bit of a wow, because we sat and talked about it, but we weren't, looking at the shift in numbers.
Well, what I love about it is we're talking about 5 years out in projections. And when we talk about historical accuracy, it's always compared to the next year. Well, isn't that nice? We're getting the ability to actually determine whether or not the methodologies for the out years, and looking back, have the accuracy ratios of what might be considered within tolerance, and also the ability to articulate why or why not. So any of these conversations, I welcome them. And then I also will say at certain times, stay tuned, because that's what we'll be having this conversation. That's why we have an annual revisit of a 5-year forecast. And all of the feedback is really for the continuous improvement. It's for all of us to get better in our methodologies and our projections, a better way to account for those projections and methodologies, to account for the items that I think both you and Ms. Schultz brought up. But again, we're going to have to stay tuned on some of these, because I can't sit here and say to you, oh, yeah, 5 years, that's exactly what's going to be. It's based upon the birth to kindergarten ratio. It's based upon that dip that we've seen. We see a leveling off at the elementary level, because I know over time, because I was raised in Fairfax County Public Schools, we have gone up at a high rate, we've leveled off, we've kind of dropped a little bit, and then we've gone up again, and then we're leveling off a little bit. So shift happens.
Oh yeah, no, I understand that, but I
FT,
but,
SHIFT.
But I think the point I'm trying to kind of maybe put in the parking lot that I'll want to visit with you, and since Ms. Schultz and I share schools, maybe we tag team you and get a 2-for-1 meeting.
Right.
But what's concerning to me is how can these schools that were all built about the same time, one's got 25% more students in it, but it's showing itself as being actually lower in capacity numbers. So again, something's not making sense about capacity utilization, and therefore what are the warning signs? I'm fine with having been a meeting manager. I got the chance with Dahlia to talk to staff. I wanted to hear from our colleagues whose districts were being impacted by this, and so far this evening I'm not hearing any pushback from our colleagues about the direction you're wanting. So in terms of what you need for us to vote on the CIP, it sounds like everything's fine. So I just wanted give you that input. Ms. Evans, since you and I share Annandale High School, my ears pricked up when you mentioned Bryn Mawr, and so even though that sits in your district, I'm happy to participate in dialogue that's obviously about the whole, and how we look out for Annandale. North Springfield Elementary is projected in 5 years to be at 74%, and that's one of the remaining sort of legacy elementary schools that's in my district but feeds into Annandale. So I think you and I want to probably have a shared conversation about Annandale in general. I wanted to make sure for staff that you guys, we talked about Wakefield Forest Elementary, but for my colleagues, that elementary school is projected at 134% capacity. So it's one of the high enrollment schools based on projections. So obviously we want to look at that. The other thing I just wanted to bring to the attention of my colleagues, because there are 4 district members and 3 at-larges that all have a relationship with Woodson High School. And as you know, with 2 boundary changes, Woodson's grown in numbers, and they are trying to figure out at some point if Woodson's going to need some sort of modular addition. And yet Woodson has physical space in the building right now that's being used by DIT, Department of Information Technology, and how they utilize it primarily is it's tech staffed in their little green vans that come park their cars, drive out, and service the county. So the question becomes, do you put Woodson kids in a trailer while staff really doesn't really use the building because they just come park their cars and then go out? And so Mr. Plattenberg and his staff and I have been, looking at, that's as much a board level decision of, do we put kids in trailers while we have, support programs inside our school buildings? Or do we obviously look at where we can, students are in the building and being instructed first. So I wanted that sort of as a, hey, heads up. And Mary Beth Loveclass, who's a fellow Woodson mom and actually fellow Woodson alum, with my husband, she knows that this is something that we're looking at. But I wanted that on people's radar. The other thing is that when I did review my district with staff, it's amazing how many split feeders and even some attendance islands I have in Braddock District. And so that's something that I'm very mindful to staff, that with everything that's going on with Route 1 and some of the other regions where we're looking at needing to do some boundary adjustments, I did share with them that I'm trying to be very mindful and very patient, that it's not like something that has to be fixed tomorrow. But obviously, it's wonderful when we have full feeders and not a lot of split feeders, and especially not attendance islands in the area. So that's something that I'll want to make sure we have as a parking lot. And if it didn't make it into the printed version, then I guess you guys are doing sort of a revised addendum or something. I want to make sure we kind of just have that noted for the public. I think those were the big things that were of my concern, especially for within Braddock. And then I will also say that I think we have a real responsibility as a school system, that where we can look at utilizing empty seats, we want to have, I think, some very strategic conversations about how we look at the preserving neighborhood schools, but also looking at the fact that with limited resources, how do we leave seats empty in one area while we're, adding somewhere else? I think we have to be, bringing down that number of students in trailers, cottages, modulars, whatever you want to call them, when they're not in a primary building. I think we have to be looking at that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I will speak briefly before Ms. Strauss's go back. Thank you. I think a lot of my questions have been asked as well, and I look forward to meeting tomorrow to discuss Thoreau and Jackson further. In addition, I think the capacity concerns, I have 2 Providence schools and 2 that are part Providence on that top high utilization list. So hopefully tomorrow or soon, I'd like to hear more about the idea of the Del Loring Center and Pimmet Hills. I know are on there, what that means, what kind of time frame we're looking at for that. And because I know that I continue to have pretty high capacity in those areas, so we'd like to discuss that. And also if the changes to the AAP Center will affect those Mosby Woods numbers, when we can kind of have a sense of what that will be, if that will be a big change. So beyond that, I do look forward to our meeting, and thank you again. And I will pass it on to Ms. Strauss, and then a quick go back to Ms. Schultz as well.
Yeah, and just one other thing.
Okay, all right. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of you for your willingness to meet. Individually, school board members, and with community members. You all are extremely patient, and parents always care deeply about what school they attend. So I just want to publicly thank you for your patience, for your wisdom, and your willingness to continue to work on these issues. Okay. The sort of the Tysons region, and we share that McLean, Langley, Marshall, and probably bits and pieces of others. And certainly you all are aware that Spring Hill Elementary is very concerned, because right now just about all of the Tysons development on the map is within Spring Hill. And I know, I also want to say that there's a small working group that I know Mr. Sneed has met with, and they were very appreciative of that. And they said they learned a lot, and they've learned that it's rather complicated, and would like to have a follow-up meeting. But I do think we need to find a way to help the communities surrounding Tyson's so that they have some idea of how we're going to go forward. Because right now, it does look on the paper, and I know that's nobody's intent, but it looks on paper that the entire growth at Tyson's will go into all of Spring Hill. It'll be 500-600 kids. Well, first of all, it's a long way out, but we do need to come up with a way to help show how we are going to thoughtfully go forward. Because again, they live with all of the cranes and the building and the destruction and the building up, and it's frightening, I think. So they would like some assurance that they're not going to have to absorb everything that's going on. The other question, sort of, and the specific questions that I have, I know that in the CIP you talk about eliminating the Westbriar Island and bringing them into Cove and Run. Where are we with that? Is that something? Obviously, it's not immediate. I mean, because again, we have to utilize the space that we have available, try to align schools better. This does, whatever happens with Westbriar, has an impact with Tyson's, has an impact with Spring Hill, Cove and Run, all the rest. So that is one. I'm going to do a series of questions, and then you can come back. So Westbriar, sort of the whole Tyson's area. To keep, as we reshuffle this, trying to keep people in a logical pyramid progression, because right now we've got lots of splits. And that is a concern in the community. And they're saying, well, as we move forward, can we clean that one up? So that's second question, how do we help the community deal with that? Then also, Ms. Palchuk had mentioned the PIMIT and the Dunloring. We need to explain, again, to this broader community how that's going to work, sort of the timeline, what may happen, what may not happen, so that our little working group would like to talk with us again, which I think we need to do. But I would propose that we have at some point a larger meeting, sort of a community town hall, to take a look at the development around Tyson's, Silverline, et cetera, involving what we know are going to be changes over time, PIMIT, Dunloring, other changes, not that we're going to have all of the answers. Parents make their decisions where they're going to live and how many children and all the rest of that. But I know the community, I think, would be interested, and it would help them to understand, because right now I have sort of isolated pockets of parents who don't understand the totality of it. And we have parents who are concerned about these buildings going up. So that's my
right. I just wanted to interject is that area, the Tyson's, McLean, Langley, is very, very complicated.
Yes. And parents are beginning to understand that, which is a good thing.
Right. And, the boundaries are a little bit, I'm a little kludgy is the nicest way to, and it spills all the way down to the end of Route 7, as you and I know. So I think that we just want to be very thoughtful before we move, out to that community, just simply because there's an inevitability that we're going to have to move some kids between Marshall, McLean, and Langley. I mean, I don't know that there's any option. So some of those folks would probably be okay with it, but some maybe would not be quite as receptive as we would
I know.
hope.
But we have to be honest when people are asking us questions and do the best we can, because a lot of it has to do with how quickly the change comes. Right now, the Board of Supervisors is saying it's a little slower, but the parents are nervous. So that is one piece of it. The other question, again, is our ability to figure out how many people are actually going to put their children at Haycock. That I know, we shake our heads. We think we know what's going on, and then all of a sudden, there they are, regardless of how many houses there are. But this works into the PIMIT and the Dunloring and everything. Okay, so those are the pieces there, and it's just we need to make sure we have the best information out there, so that the rumor mill does not continue, and to help sort of keep the blood pressure down as best we can. Now, big picture site. So elementary sites, again, when I met with you, you were showing me sort of the places in the county where there is more residential, multifamily residential townhouses, what have you, that are projected to be built. And I have met with Dranesville supervisor and member of the planning commission to take a look at that, because they will be in the driver's seat along with all of them, all the other members of the board of supervisors, to help us find sites. And so you think, so how many elementary sites are we still lacking?
Well, that's an interesting point you just raised. I mean, the one site that you're referring to, Amy and I and some members of our planning staff met with zoning, and this particular area, we had looked at purchasing those properties a number of years ago, but they were too costly. And the rezoning request was to convert a multi-use, so business and some residential, to roughly 90% residential. About 2,000 townhomes is it, which we didn't have when we looked at the original zoning application. And so the most important thing is, and the reason I brought up the sites is, we can barely get by with the money that we have just to support our program to renovate and build where we need, but to buy a property. So the site that we looked at, there was two of them that were bifurcated by a road. We looked at it for a high school site, and they wanted $100 million 3 years ago for the site. And even when we looked at sites for McNair, so it depends where you are, there is so costly that in order to purchase a site, you would, depending on the cost, you would do some serious harm just to your ability to, handle the. Even if you had a site for 25 or $50 million, that's a one-time expenditure in a particular fiscal year, and it would prove very, very problematic. So when we met with the folks from zoning, conversation wasn't, here, you guys want to look at buy a site. Our implication was, we need to be provided a site. We do not have enough money between our capital requirements, and to purchase a site associated with the development. And so hopefully that's the message.
Right, and that
That's
right,
what the one. So you asked for your whole region. The other one is, the Tysons. So you have that site that's already designated for that
Right.
school. And then Mr. Steed mentioned up around the McNair area. So you've got the Dulles Technology Quarter West.
Yeah.
You've got the McNair area, and then you have the one over the Spring Hill discussion.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a lot of action. So I can understand why there's a lot of unrest
Yeah.
and uneasiness. Our processes, and this is probably part of the conversation we need to have with your communities further, our processes are such that when the development becomes, that's when what's already planned for then gets the zoning to alleviate overcrowding of the influence that's happening from that development. When the yields that we project are not coming in yet, it's premature for us, from our standpoint, to give all of that plan and execute that plan in advance of. But I understand the community saying, because, by the way, that plan, as it currently resides, when you look at the impact of Spring Hill, for example, would impact some of those family members who don't want to be impacted.
That's right.
And
That's usually the way
it's
it
a
is.
healthy problem to have. But I think, so much like the conversation we were saying about Bucknell and Region 3, to your point, and Kevin's comment about the kludginess up the Route 7, we have to look both short-term and long-term
Exactly.
in that whole region. And I believe those conversations need to begin for as much reassurance as we can possibly give in the short-term projection, the accuracy of that, and the longer-term projections that we're obviously having some questions about.
Right, exactly. Then the other part is whether or not we are going to have a site for another high school. Because I did raise that with our Board of Supervisors. And before we get too far down the line, the question is finding a site, having enough money to purchase it, and I just want to remind us that we actually own, not a huge site, but 30 acres at Hutchison. And we own it. So
That's pretty much the only arrow in our quiver. We don't own anything else. And when I saw the price tag to look, I was not, that's, if we had money, I would, Hutchison would never have been my first choice.
Right, and maybe it's not the ultimate solution,
But-
but at least my colleagues need to know that we actually own, I believe it's 30 acres.
38.
Okay, 38. It's not, wouldn't be a traditional, it'd be more like a Washington and Lee High School, but it is large enough to do that. And, whether or not that's what actually happens, and if that would happen, we would have to also do an urban rebuild of Hutchison Elementary. But those require much smaller sites, and that would be one way to go. But we own the land, and we don't own anything else other than the backside of McNair, which is perhaps the other thing that we will do there is build 2 schools at that site. So it is important that our talks with the members of the Board of Supervisors and their staff, they kind of understand the corner that we're in, because I'm finding they don't. They haven't heard this, nor are they completely understanding of what's in the pipeline of change from mixed use to residential. A lot of them haven't seen that yet. So it's important that we help our colleagues understand what's going to come in the next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, because you have to plan now for that eventuality. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we're ready to review next steps. Oh, my apologies, Ms. Schultz, and then we'll go to next steps.
Another excellent question coming. For context, that was the other issue that I sort of see with this that makes it difficult for us to ascertain issues. And I do it for example. If you have a school that has 239 students and 8% change is reflected up here as an 8% change, that's 19 students. If you have a school that has 1,003 students, the mood of the impact is not visible here. So, I have put in a request for us to have a meeting about this, because before we're final on some of this stuff, I really do think there are a few more things that could reflect, help us understand by reflecting the data that's here, that is good data, but it's not necessarily manifested in such a way that it helps us in executive decision making. I know that you've come, just like the budget discussion earlier, where we're pleading with, okay, tell us what some of the priorities are, but then if we look at it and we see the pros and the cons of what's before us and what's out there and can ask some meaningful questions, I do think the presentation of some of this information in such a way that it lets us see where the impacts may be, may potentially put some other things on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have next steps that we could look at? Okay, so it looks like we have a couple on there. Is there anyone else who felt there was one that should be on there? Ms. Corbett Sanders? Mike, please. Thank you.
I think we have to put in the recommendation that was presented by Mr. Plattenberg regarding the item.
The changes to
Yeah.
item on page 41, the changes to items 1 and 2. It will be reflected. So there's no need for a next step because
Okay,
that's happening.
just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. Ms. Strauss?
So the one I suggested, it is the development of Tyson's, it's McLean, Marshall, Langley, and so schedule a community town hall meeting to look at the development of Tyson's, McLean, Marshall, Langley area and the potential impact on schools. Because I think this is a learning, right, a learning opportunity. Right.
Thank you. Are we ready to vote on these? Okay, so number 1, schedule a work session for a formal presentation and discussion of removal of temporary classrooms reports. All hands in support. Looks like we have overwhelming support. Thank you. Number 2, schedule a community town hall meeting to look at development of Tyson's, McLean, Marshall, Langley area, and the potential impact on schools. Do we want Tyson's on there? Because it looks like we have high schools, and then I think we get what we mean.
I'm not
but
sure,
that's fine.
why is this the next step for this? If that needs to be done, why isn't that just part of,
I don't care however you want to do it. We just, a sense of the
A sense
board.
of the board that we would like it to happen somehow, and we
Yeah.
can discuss with staff.
That's right,
at that
exactly how
point,
and when.
And those of us
And because it
impacted.
involves more than me.
Right.
It's a bunch of us.
Okay, so can we get a sense of support for this happening in the future? Okay, thank you. So it looks like we have 2 next steps. Yes?
Do we need the language on the holistic approach to the impact of Route 1 schools and all that's being done there? Because that's the same situation as item 2. I'm not sure we're quite ready for that it belongs in the CIP itself, but it certainly does.
Well, I would think it wouldn't be in the CIP at this time. I'm thinking, but I think, if Janie wants it and that's her purview, and if you and I say we're not ready for it, then I think that's our purview. Yeah, right.
And did you need any decision on those 2 priorities, or we're good? Okay. Very good. Well, thank you, everyone. I know it's been a long day. Appreciate it. See you in a couple of days.
Logistical question, what do we do with our leftover dots?
Give them, just leave them on the table and we'll reuse them.
Okay.
Reuse them. So you can start on February. We'll start on February. There was no way I was going to let that happen. We were too tired.
You weren't gonna let what happen?
Well, your suggestion, I just got it's too tired. But then you're like, put your dots up for February. I was like, no. I didn't ignore it. I was just like, it was just.
Next time it'll probably be quicker.
Don't go away. Really want to go away.
I just feel that